Welcome. On Christmas morning, 1939, a large package was delivered to the front steps of the museum, which was open that morning. The director had been pre-warned and he was here to receive it, but wrapped up in wrapping paper was this painting. It was a gift to the museum of the Putnam sisters, Anne and Amy Putnam, who had purchased it in New York from the famous art dealer Knoedler's while they were back in New York visiting the World's Fair in 1939, which closed at the end of October. And this picture was in one of the galleries that they saw there, and they liked it and purchased it and had it. It took a lot of arranging, but they had it arranged so that it was delivered Christmas morning. And of course, the museum staff and the director and everyone were just ecstatic. Now, the Putnam sisters had already been our most generous donors of old master paintings since the early 30s. And this was, like number 35 of whatever they were giving us. Over their whole careers with the museum, they gave us several hundred old master paintings worth, many, many millions of dollars. So we're very generous to we're very grateful for their generosity. This one was interesting because, as I said, it was discovered in New York. And they went back to the World's Fair the following year and obtained a second painting. It's the one that used to be attributed to Bronzino. I don't see it if it's in this room or not, but it's the one that's the Florentine noblewoman. So they really bought two paintings a year apart from the same gallery and donated them to the museum. The picture is of Henrietta Maria, the Queen of England. She was the wife of King Charles I. Now, he was the Stuart king who ran afoul of Parliament and was ultimately deposed in 1649 and beheaded. And so it was a kind of an ill-fated marriage. They had a good marriage early on. They had a huge brood of children. But of course, with the falling out with Parliament, Henrietta Maria had to flee to France, which was in fact her home country. She was the daughter of King Henry IV of France. And of course, that makes her the sister of King Louis XIII. So she was very well bred and used to the aristocratic life and of the finer things and so on. And you can see that she is displaying that kind of wealth and taste in this portrait. This beautiful blue silk gown with all of the gold buttons and clips. Her pearls, for instance, in fact, her pearl drop earrings are reputedly a very, very famous pair of exquisite pearls known as the Mazarin pearls. In fact, she had to hawk the pearls after her husband was killed and she had to flee to France in order for her and her family to survive. And so the Cardinal Mazarin, who was of course the chief minister to the King of France, he was quite a collector of jewels and gems and so on, and he acquired them. And they have quite an interesting and bloody history. We won't go into it. It's kind of a byway that we can't go down right now. But those kinds of jewels were, the essential elements of the aristocratic classes at the time because they're really symbols of status and wealth, and you would always dress up in your finest. The fact is, the picture by Sir Anthony van Dyck is of a type that he sort of invented. A lot of other artists attribute this style to him, and a contemporary of his called it casual gentility or casual romance. Those were the two terms applied to it. And in a way, it stands out from the typical aristocratic portraiture of the day, even the kind of portraiture that Anthony van Dyck normally practiced, which was more in the grand manner, or what came later to be called the swagger portrait, where they were often full-length pictures of a standing figure, whether male or female, but they were sort of haughty, and they were dressed in all their finest regalia in what was called court costume, very elaborately embroidered and decorated, very stiff, with lots of lace collars and all of the lace trim. And you can see that this portrait of Queen Henrietta lacks that kind of formality. And in fact, the gown she's wearing is a type that was known as a night dress. And it's not quite a nightgown like you'd get into bed with, but it's sort of the casual, loose costume that a woman would wear around the house when she's not out in public. And so she's not in her full court costume. It's much looser, has these big billowing sleeves. And in fact, a lot of scholars attribute this kind of costume in aristocratic portraiture to Anthony van Dyck, that he was the first to use it and the first to pose his sitters in that costume. Now, to understand how this portrait was made, you sort of have to know a little bit about the practice of the time in the studios of artists like Anthony van Dyck or Peter Paul Rubens, for instance, who was his great rival. Van Dyck, in fact, was Flemish. He was born in what is today Belgium. He came from Antwerp. And he actually worked for about 2 years in the studio of Peter Paul Rubens, who sort of overshadowed him and kind of used up all the oxygen in Belgium. And so really to make his career thrive, Anthony van Dyck left Belgium. He went first in 1620 and worked for a very short time in the court of Charles I's father, James I, doing the same sorts of aristocratic portraits for that court. And remember, James I was the first Stuart king from Scotland and then became king of Ireland and England as well. But Anthony van Dyck did not find the court of James I very congenial. So he left there and went to Italy, where he spent about 7 to 8 years working first in Rome and then in Genoa. And that's where he really evolved his grand manner portrait style. These great full-length pictures of aristocrats, royalty and so on, cardinals and people in the papal court. And he gained quite a reputation doing that, so that when he finally did come back to England in 1632 with the new court, this is of course Charles's court, he found great reception there, and they were very, very pleased to have him. His portraits became very popular. He was incredibly busy. And so like his sort of predecessor, Rubens, he had to set up a big workshop to keep up with all of the commissions that he was getting. So he would have anywhere from 6 to 10 painters working under him. And it became a sort of issue with some of the people who commissioned these portraits as to whether the hand of the master himself is the one who painted the picture or whether his assistants did it. And he would delegate wherever he could work to his assistants. Even on a portrait like this, the face and perhaps the hands would be done by the master, and then he would have people working for him who might do the costume. In fact, there are some scholars who claim this, in fact, is a copy, that Van Dyck had nothing to do with this picture, other than that it was in his studio, because in fact there is another copy fairly similar to this in the Wallace collection in London, although everyone acknowledges theirs is inferior to ours. And I've seen it. It actually isn't quite as nicely done. So some scholars speculate, in fact, there's a lost original out there by Van Dyck's own hand, and that this is one of his studio assistants making a copy. Because when a very successful portrait was made, everybody wanted a copy of it. And quite often the monarch or the sitter would order more copies of a portrait to give out to their supporters and friends, or to send off to some relative across in Europe or something. And so that's how these things multiplied. Now we know, for instance, that Van Dyck painted 13 solo portraits of the Queen, and more than twice that many of the Queen and her husband, King Charles, together as a dual portrait. So they ordered a lot of portraits from him in his studio. I would say, though, on the balance, our own curator, John Marchiari, who has recently left, but also a lot of other important scholars, including the leading scholar, Erik Larson, on Van Dyck, conclude that this, in fact, is an original by Anthony van Dyck, and that if any assistant's hands are to be found in it, it would be in the costume and that sort of thing. And it's kind of interesting, again, to get back to what I was saying earlier about how these workshops worked. Obviously, these rich and powerful people didn't want to sit for hours and hours and hours having their portrait made. Usually, the artist would sit for a very short time, no more than an hour, and they would sketch several views of the person's face. And then that would be it. They would go back to the studio, they'd have a stand-in, or a sit-in in this case, someone who sat in for the original person to get the costume right, and then they would simply put the face in where it belonged. And a lot of the portraits, sort of like we today have portraits of the president or the governor in public offices and post offices and things like that, A lot of these portraits we made for that kind of purpose, and they would be sent to different locations. And so, based on one original sketch of the sitter, they could then crank out many different poses, changing the costume. A standing portrait and a sitting portrait could both be made from the same face. And so when you start lining up all these 13 portraits of Henrietta Maria, you'll start seeing that many of them come from exactly the same sitting. It must have only been sketched or drawn by Van Dyck once. What's interesting too about this is a lot of the accoutrements were not really the sitters, but they belonged to Van Dyck. He must have had a kind of a costume collection, because this very same dress shows up in another portrait of a different woman, the Countess of Cleveland. So presumably he had this model stand-in his studio, and I'll go put the blue dress on. Probably the Queen never wore that blue dress, but it's perfect for this particular portrait. In fact, this is often called the Queen in Blue. And in the inventory of the Royal Collection, shortly after the death of Charles, there's actually a list of a painting of the Queen in Blue, and we think that's this one, but there's two of them listed. One was given to the Count of Holland, and one was in the Royal Collection. So they were both by Van Dyck, at least according to this inventory. So whether it's the same blue dress or not, we aren't sure. The other interesting little note is that the crown is to her right, and this is a very common convention, not just by Van Dyck, but a lot of the portrait painters of royalty. You'll see it in portraits of her husband Charles, of their predecessors, of even Isabella of Spain. You often will have the crown sort of off to the side, not on their head. That would be a little ostentatious unless it's a full-on state portrait, like a coronation portrait or something. But here, it's just there to remind everyone, okay, well, she is the queen. But these little clips and things on the dress, they weren't part of the dress. They were separate pieces of jewelry. And because they're very precious, they're made of gold and have jewels, they would put them on the dress when they're wearing it, but they would take them off and put them in their jewel chest and bring them out and put them on a different dress later on. So we shouldn't think of them as being part of the actual dress. To sort of circle around and talk a little bit more about the history of the painting, it has a kind of a tragic history in a way. We don't know exactly how it got into the family that owned it in England. They were called the Marquises of Aylesbury. The family name was Brudenell Bruce. It was a very distinguished English family, one of those with generations of soldiers and so on. And the particular owner who sold it was the 6th Marquis, and he was on hard times. It was that period of the very early 20th century, and the Depression had hit, and England was in an agricultural depression. And a lot of those landed gentry, with the imposition of income tax after the First World War, exorbitant income taxes and estate taxes, death taxes, they had to sell off a lot of their property and artwork and jewels and so on just to keep their estates together. And so that's the situation that the Marquis of Aylesbury found himself in 1927. And he sold the painting to Lord Duveen, the famous art dealer in London with branches in Paris and New York. Duveen had this interesting network of spies all over England just for the purpose of sniffing out aristocrats who were on hard times with the hope that they could snatch up their paintings before anyone else heard about them going on the market so they could get a bargain basement price. Well, it turns out that the Marquis of Aylesbury was quite a sharp guy, and he really negotiated a pretty hard deal. But Duveen did acquire the painting. It was apparently in very bad condition. It had a cut in the canvas, and it had to be sent off to Paris to be repaired and cleaned. And when it cleaned, it came out with this beautiful blue. It kind of was a dingy, darkish gray when it was dirty, after all those centuries of hanging in this English stately home. And so it was finally cleaned and sent across to New York, where it was sold in late 1927 to a very wealthy foreign investment banker and broker, a man named Ernst Rosenfeld, who was a fairly new man. He made, he didn't inherit wealth. He made his money in the investment banking and international exchange markets. He lived in a very posh Park Avenue apartment that had a rent of $23,000 a month. In 1927. It was one of those two-story duplex apartments overlooking Park Avenue. He went on a buying spree in about a 4-year period and bought paintings from all the major dealers in New York, Duveen, Seligman, Knoedler, and all the others. And all of this was bought on credit. As you can imagine, that in those days, these wealthy folks didn't pay cash for anything, they bought on credit. Well, along comes the stock market crash in 1929. And Mr. Rosenfeld, along with a lot of his colleagues who were deeply into investments, lost their shirts. He staggered along until 1937, making very, very small token payments to Duveens, not just for this painting. He owed them hundreds of thousands of dollars for a whole series of paintings and a couple of sculptures, and he owed Knoedler's and Seligman's as well. And of course, it was in their interest to keep him making at least token payments, because if they returned all the paintings to the dealers then stuck with the stock and has no one to buy them again. So he'd make very token payments, but finally in 1937, he just couldn't go on anymore, and he killed himself. He shot himself in his apartment with this painting hanging in the library where he was. So it's got a tragic story. I don't want to be ghoulish about it, but that's kind of part of the history. Well, his widow, of course, had to settle all his debts. He was insolvent, and so she pretty much sold off whatever she could and returned to the various dealers whatever artworks they would take back, and she was able to, settle the debt, moved out of the grandiose apartment into a much smaller place, found another rich man to marry, and so she made out okay. But the painting then was back in a dealer, this time not Duveen's, but in Knoedler's. So Knoedler's was fortunate enough to be able to attract the Putnam sisters' interest, and they purchased the painting, as I said at the very beginning. That's all my prepared remarks. Do you have any questions? Yes?
Could you talk about her hand?
Yes.
It almost looks, it's very limp, and the fingertips are so narrow and pointed. It's an unusual.
That's a good point. You have struck upon one of Van Dyck's characteristics. In fact, they're called Van Dyck hands. It's a type of depiction that he apparently evolved while he was painting portraits in Genoa and perhaps in Rome. It's part and parcel of his way of presenting the aristocrats, in that they are not people who do manual labor. They're people who are graceful, elegant. Even the men have hands like this, kind of looking very effete. And it's just one more sign of their aristocratic class, just as is the very, very pale complexion. I mean, that was the ideal in those days for a woman, not to get a tan, not to be ruddy-faced, but to be just deathly pale. In fact, they would put powder on their faces to look more pale. So these languorous, sort of long-fingered hands are part and parcel of it. It's meant to be an expression of their breeding, their grace, their elegance. They're almost boneless. I mean, like you say, they're very limp. And those are very characteristic of a style that, like I said, was called Van Dyck hands. The other thing that's kind of interesting is he very often will have the ladies holding flowers. In this case, it's 2 pink roses, but it's a little touch that he uses over and over and over again to give them that air of grace and elegance. The other thing that's interesting that comes out from your question is that, in fact, she's a fairly attractive woman, but a lot of the written accounts of the time say her portraits don't look very much like her, that people who saw her portraits first and then met her were shocked because they said she's very homely, she has big horsey teeth, and is kind of small and stoop-shouldered. And so obviously Van Dyck, knew where his money was coming from, and he flattered the people that he was painting portraits of. Now, he was not alone in that. If an artist at that time had painted a true portrait of someone, they probably would have been beheaded, or at the very least would not get any more work. There is actually one quote from an aristocrat of the time that Van Dyck painted a portrait of, where she says, I looked at this portrait, I'm paraphrasing because it's in this very archaic old English, but, I looked at this portrait Van Dyck painted of me, and I didn't recognize the woman there because, she looked old and sagging skin and on and on and on. And then I looked in the mirror, and it was me. So she actually acknowledged that, he did a fairly true portrait, but that seems to be the exception, especially with the aristocracy, because he did tend to enhance their appearance. Any other questions?
My question is kind of more on the art technique.
Mm-hmm.
Was it something from that school in that period? Because I guess with Da Vinci there was that smoky technique. So the having the left side of that kind of blurred out, more of the detail on the right, were they emphasizing a perspective or a use of light, or?
Yeah, it was. He was following in line with the tradition of his time from Rubens and other painters, that he was trying to give a sense of depth to it. So if you had the whole background, one uniform color, it loses that sense of depth. So even if the figure is made up of light and shade, if the background isn't also varied, it looks very flat. So he does have light coming from one distinct direction. But even within his time, say for instance, a Rembrandt does the much more smoky, dark kind of treatment, whereas Rubens has a much brighter, and this brings out kind of a trend in art at the time where you had a kind of a clash between two forces within art, one that wanted to use color as the main focus of expression in a painting, as opposed to those who preferred sort of an outline drawing. It's hard to explain this very briefly, but it was the colorists versus the draftsmen. And so Rubens was the great proponent of color, and so it followed right on, and this controversy goes right on down into the early 19th century, and it gets into neoclassicism. So it's a very fundamental difference. And so I would say Van Dyck is in the camp of Rubens in that he likes vivid color. This is one that is rather muted compared to some of the aristocratic portraits that Van Dyck did, where they have gold-colored lame or beautiful satins and silks that are much more vivid color than this one. But yeah, it's part of that tradition of trying to give the figure an illusionistic roundness by varying the amount of light and shadow from one area or another. And I guess you could say the roots are in Leonardo da Vinci and his era, Raphael, but he had this thing that you mentioned, the smokiness, and that's called sfumato. He was kind of the originator of that, and really it was selectively used by artists after him, Rembrandt being sort of one of them. But for an aristocratic portrait, most people didn't want that smokiness. They wanted a clarity that made their portrait readable and presentable. So it would not have been something applied to a work by Anthony van Dyck.
Well, it seems like it also plays up the figure. There's nothing to distract your attention
Right.
in the background.
Yes.
The focus is on her.
Exactly.
It's all a statement about her.
Absolutely, you're right. And one of the other big traditions at this time was to have like drapes and classical columns in the background. And those are more for the formal state portraits, usually the grand manner. As I say, this one's a little more of the relaxed, informal type, and I think that's perhaps one reason that he simplified it. But if you think of works by, for instance, not just Van Dyck, but some of the followers who did, like Gainsborough and the 18th century painters, Reynolds and so on, you'll often see, and even in the Baroque, it's kind of a tradition that goes as far back as the Baroque, but the idea of the grand portrait of the standing aristocrat with the big marble column in the corner and the big drape, that is for a more formal kind of portrait. And so this is a much more relaxed and intimate portrait. Well, thank you all for your attention. Appreciate it.